This bill will be used by the Kremlin to show the world that while Washington demands that others follow the rules, we are happy to break them when we see fit. In a multipolar world, Washington can no longer expect to act with impunity, particularly when dealing with a nuclear power. We understood the serious dangers that our country faced during the Cold War, but 3 decades of hubris and repeated foreign policy disasters proves that Washington's foreign policy establishment is badly broken. A good way to start on the road to fixing that broken foreign policy is rejecting this disastrous bill, which will only delay and possibly end the peace negotiations. I object.
President.
Objections heard. Senator.
I appreciate my colleague from Kentucky's long-standing
You just watched Rand Paul perform what has become his signature obstructionist ritual in the Senate chamber, standing alone against bipartisan consensus to block legislation that would force Russia to pay for the catastrophic devastation it has unleashed on Ukraine, and the sheer audacity of what you witnessed should make your blood boil, because this is a senator invoking multipolar world rhetoric straight from Vladimir Putin's propaganda playbook, while Ukrainian cities burn, and Ukrainian children freeze in the rubble of apartment buildings destroyed by Russian missiles that were paid for by the very same Russian state whose assets Rand Paul now shields from accountability. Let me take you deeper into this moment, because what just happened represents something far more insidious than ordinary political disagreement. This is a glimpse into how libertarian isolationism dressed up in the garments of constitutional principle becomes a perfectly designed vehicle for authoritarian enablement. And before we're done here, you're going to understand exactly how the Repo Implementation Act that Paul just sabotaged would have created a mechanism to transfer approximately $300 billion in frozen Russian sovereign assets held by the United States and G7 allies directly to Ukraine for reconstruction. While Paul's objection just handed Putin a propaganda victory, he couldn't have scripted better himself. Here's what makes this moment absolutely explosive, and I need you to grasp the full magnitude of the moral failure on display, because the total cost of reconstruction and recovery in Ukraine is $524 billion over the next decade. According to the most recent joint assessment by the Ukrainian government, the World Bank, the European Commission, and the United Nations, an almost incomprehensible sum that represents approximately 2.8 times the estimated nominal GDP of Ukraine for 2024, meaning Ukraine's entire economy would have to operate for nearly 3 years with every single dollar of output dedicated to reconstruction just to begin addressing the physical devastation. And yet sitting in European and American financial institutions right now are Russian state funds that could cover more than half of this catastrophic bill without American or European taxpayers contributing a single additional cent. The legislation Paul just blocked, building on the Rebuilding Economic Prosperity and Opportunity Repo for Ukrainians Act, that became law in April 2024 with broad support in both the House and the Senate, which authorizes the president to seize, confiscate, transfer, or vest any Russian sovereign assets subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, would have implemented a regular quarterly schedule for transferring these frozen assets to Ukraine, essentially repurposing frozen Russian sovereign assets held in the United States for transfer to Ukraine every 90 days, creating a predictable funding stream that would allow Ukraine to plan reconstruction efforts while the war still rages, and establishing the moral and legal principle that the aggressor nation pays for the destruction it causes. But watch how Paul frames his objection, because this is where the rhetoric becomes so perfectly calibrated to sound reasonable, while advancing a fundamentally unreasonable position. He invokes multipolar world language that mirrors precisely the geopolitical vision that Putin himself articulates in his speeches, justifying Russian imperialism, warning that Washington can no longer expect to act with impunity, which is frankly a breathtaking inversion of moral reality, given that Russia is the nation acting with impunity by launching an illegal, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine that has caused what experts describe as one of the most egregious violations of international law since 1945. The senator claims this bill would be used by the Kremlin to show the world that while Washington demands that others follow the rules, we are happy to break them when we see fit, which requires us to grapple with a central question that exposes the intellectual bankruptcy of this entire line of argument. Are we really to believe that seizing the financial assets of an aggressor nation that has violated the most fundamental prohibition in international law against wars of conquest somehow represents a greater threat to global order than allowing that aggressor nation to escape all financial accountability for obliterating entire cities and destroying critical civilian infrastructure, including a 70% increase in damaged or destroyed energy assets since early 2024, including power generation, transmission, distribution infrastructure, and district heating. The legal arguments around sovereign asset seizure are genuinely complex, and I want you to understand them because this matters enormously for how we think about international law's capacity to respond to mass atrocities. Traditional central bank assets held in foreign countries are immune from jurisdiction under international law, which is why the largest holders of Russian assets in the EU, including Belgium, France, Luxembourg, and Germany, continue to oppose outright seizure, with Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever warning that confiscating Russian sovereign funds would amount to an act of war, while French President Emmanuel Macron has held that international law clearly prohibits seizure of these assets. But here's what those making the case for seizure understand, and what the historical moment demands we grapple with. A September 2023 report by the Renew Democracy Initiative, with lead author Lawrence Tribe, concluded that Russia's arguments against confiscating its frozen state assets and transferring them to Ukraine have no validity, either practically or under U.S. or international law, arguing specifically that confiscation would be permissible under the international doctrine of countermeasure, according to which an action that would ordinarily violate international law is permissible if it is undertaken with the aim of inducing another state to resume compliance with international law. And what Tribe and other legal scholars are saying is that when a nation commits an act as fundamentally destructive to the international order as launching a war of territorial conquest, the normal rules protecting sovereign immunity must yield to the imperative of holding that nation accountable and compensating its victims. Let's talk about what Rand Paul's voting record reveals, because this is not an isolated incident, but part of a consistent pattern that demands scrutiny. When the Senate voted 98-2 in 2017 to pass legislation imposing new sanctions on Russia for interference in U.S. elections, as well as aggression in Ukraine and Syria, Rand Paul was one of only 2 senators voting against the measure, and in 2017, when the Senate overwhelmingly voted to impose new sanctions on Russia by a vote of 98-2, only Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul dissented, though Sanders made clear his support for Russia sanctions while opposing only the Iran provisions. Paul has repeatedly criticized interventionist foreign policy and was one of just 2 senators to vote against the 2017 Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which sanctioned Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And when you examine the pattern, what emerges is a senator who has constructed an ideological framework that functionally serves Russian interests, regardless of the specific circumstances or the severity of Russian aggression. The truly damning element is that Paul has a long history of demanding last-minute changes by holding up or threatening to delay bills on the brink of passage, including measures dealing with lynching, sanctioning Russia, preventing a federal shutdown, the defense budget, government surveillance, and providing health care to the September 11 attack first responders, which reveals a procedural approach designed to maximize his individual leverage while forcing the Senate to accommodate his demands under the threat of delay. Now I want you to understand exactly what Ukraine needs right now, and what's at stake in these debates over reconstruction funding, because this is about human lives and the viability of a democratic nation facing genocidal aggression. Direct damage in Ukraine has now reached $176 billion as of December 31, 2024, with housing, transport, energy, commerce, and industry, and education as the most affected sectors, with 13% of the total housing stock damaged or destroyed, affecting more than 2.5 million households. Think about what that means in concrete human terms. Millions of families who have lost their homes, entire communities where schools no longer exist, hospital systems that cannot function because the buildings have been bombed into rubble, and energy infrastructure so severely damaged that people face winter without heat. And when Paul talks about this somehow jeopardizing peace negotiations, his argument collapses under the weight of historical evidence and moral logic. Russia has never in its history paid reparations for any of its illegal conquests, which means that frozen assets may be the only Russian funds that ever contribute to repairing the terrible damage its war has caused in Ukraine. And any negotiation that allows Russia to escape financial accountability would simply establish the precedent that nuclear powers can wage wars of conquest as long as they're willing to accept some temporary economic pain, making future aggression more rather than less likely. The Democratic senator's response in that clip is crucial, and I want you to hear what she's really saying when she references Paul's long-standing efforts to object to sanctions. She's identifying a pattern of behavior that transcends any individual policy disagreement and represents a fundamental ideological commitment that places abstract libertarian principles about government power above the urgent moral imperatives created by mass atrocities. There's a particular kind of privilege embedded in Paul's position that we need to name explicitly. He can afford to take the long view about constitutional principles and the dangers of executive overreach, because he and his constituents are not the ones huddling in basements while Russian missiles destroy the apartment buildings above them. He's not making calculations about whether to flee his home as an occupying army approaches, and his children are not at risk of being killed by cluster munitions deliberately targeted at civilian areas. The luxury of his ideological purity is subsidized by Ukrainian blood and Ukrainian suffering, and when he invokes his oath of office to the national security of the United States of America, as he did when blocking previous Ukraine aid, he claims his oath of office is to the U.S. Constitution, not to any foreign nation, and no matter how sympathetic the cause, his oath of office is to the national security of the United States of America. What he's actually doing is constructing a vision of American national security so narrow and so isolationist that it cannot comprehend how allowing Russian imperial aggression to succeed in Europe fundamentally threatens the international order that has prevented great power wars for 80 years. Let's examine the counter-arguments about international law and precedent, because I want you to be equipped to dismantle them when you encounter them in debates. Critics worry reserves generally receive the strongest sovereign immunity protections, and nations need confidence that their property rights will be honored under international law to participate in the global economy, with concerns that Russia's abhorrent unlawful aggression in Ukraine may well disqualify them from enjoying reserve protections, but many nations will wonder what exactly the limits are if seizure becomes permissible. This is the slippery slope argument dressed up in legal language, the claim that if we seize Russian assets for launching a war of territorial conquest, then suddenly every nation will fear that their reserves could be seized for any policy disagreement. But this argument fundamentally misunderstands both law and morality. Russia is guilty of using a war of aggression to destroy Ukraine, its people and its culture, and to erase it from the map, and since 1945 there have been few if any breaches of international law as serious as this, which means we're not talking about creating a precedent for ordinary sanctions or routine diplomatic conflicts. We're talking about establishing consequences for one of the most severe violations of international law conceivable. And here's the argument that should end this debate. Two common arguments against confiscating Russia's assets revolve around whether it is legal, and the precedent it supposedly sets, but the West will create a precedent whether it confiscates or does not. Therefore, the question should not be, will we set a precedent, but what kind of precedent do we want to create? Do we want to establish that launching wars of territorial conquest carries such severe financial consequences that future aggressors will think twice? Or do we want to establish that nuclear powers can wage wars of annihilation as long as they're prepared to weather some sanctions while their central bank reserves remain safely protected in perpetuity? The bipartisan nature of the opposition to Paul's obstruction is significant and worth dwelling on because it reveals how thoroughly his position has been rejected across the ideological spectrum. Senators Jim Risch, the Republican chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Sheldon Whitehouse, the Democratic ranking member of the Helsinki Commission, introduced the Repo Implementation Act, alongside co-sponsors, including Jeanne Shaheen, Chuck Grassley, Richard Blumenthal, and Lindsey Graham. They were signaling that support for Ukraine and accountability for Russian aggression transcends normal partisan divides. Even Mitch McConnell, who rarely finds himself aligned with progressive Democrats, has consistently argued aid to Ukraine isn't just charity, but bears directly on America's national security and vital interests that Russia's naked aggression not succeed. Understanding that American leadership of the liberal international order depends on demonstrating that aggression carries consequences. The isolationist wing of the Republican Party that Paul represents remains small, but disproportionately powerful because of Senate procedural rules that allow individual senators to block unanimous consent and force time-consuming procedural votes, meaning Paul can delay and obstruct even when he lacks anything close to majority support for his positions. The economic mechanisms matter here, and I need you to understand how the international community has been trying to navigate the legal complexities. In July 2024, the G7 agreed to use windfall profits from the interest on Russia's frozen assets to back loans to Ukraine as part of the $50 billion G7 Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Loans Initiative, and the Treasury Department in December 2024 disbursed $20 billion in ERA loans to Ukraine, which represents a compromise approach that seizes the profits generated by frozen assets without touching the principal. But this is where Paul's obstructionism becomes particularly damaging, because what the Repo Implementation Act would do is move beyond this half measure and authorize the transferring the estimated $5 billion in frozen Russian sovereign assets under United States jurisdiction to an interest-bearing account, and encouraging the president to repurpose at least $250 million from that account to benefit Ukraine every 90 days, creating a systematic mechanism for ongoing transfers rather than one-time loans. The moral logic here is overwhelming. Why should Russian assets continue to generate returns that might eventually revert to Russia when Ukraine needs those funds immediately to rebuild destroyed hospitals and schools and power plants? Let's talk about the endless war framing, because this is how Paul and others on both the isolationist right and the anti-interventionist left try to delegitimize continued support for Ukraine. They invoke the specter of Iraq and Afghanistan to suggest that any sustained military and economic assistance to Ukraine represents America being drawn into another forever war. But this analogy is not just flawed but actively misleading. Ukraine is not asking for American troops to fight its battles. It is asking for weapons and economic assistance to defend itself against an invasion that violates the most basic principle of post-1945 international order. And the reconstruction funding we're discussing isn't about prosecuting a war at all, but about ensuring that when this war ends, Ukraine has the capacity to rebuild and survive as an independent nation, rather than being forced into submission through economic collapse. Ukraine needs to finance its war effort, costing around $50 billion per year, and maintain its day-to-day economy. And if the West cannot sustain this level of support, then Putin's strategy of simply outlasting Western attention spans and political will becomes viable, which is exactly what Paul's obstruction facilitates regardless of his stated intentions. The clip shows something crucial in the Democratic response. When she references Paul's pattern of opposing sanctions and accountability, she's making an argument that goes beyond any individual vote to identify a senatorial career defined by providing cover for authoritarian regimes through invocations of constitutional principle and non-intervention. There's a particular kind of both-sidesism embedded in Paul's rhetoric. When he suggests that everything we say Russia's done wrong, so has China and us. He said in an interview that everything we say Russia's done wrong, so has China and us, which represents a moral relativism that refuses to distinguish between the imperfect actions of democratic nations operating under rule of law and systematic human rights abuses by authoritarian regimes. This is the same intellectual framework that allows certain segments of the left and right to convince themselves that American and Russian imperialism are somehow equivalent phenomena, ignoring the rather significant distinctions between a democratic alliance system based on voluntary membership and security guarantees versus an imperial project based on military conquest and forced subjugation of neighboring peoples. Now let's get to the heart of what's really happening when Paul talks about multipolar world dynamics and Washington's supposed hubris, because this language did not emerge in a vacuum, but represents the adoption of a specifically Russian geopolitical worldview that frames American global leadership as inherently illegitimate. Putin has spent decades constructing a narrative that portrays the post-Cold War international order as a unipolar American hegemony that must be replaced by a multipolar system in which regional powers like Russia have spheres of influence within which they can act without Western interference. And what that means in practice is that Russia should be able to dominate and control its neighbors without consequence. When Paul adopts this framing, he's not offering a neutral analysis of global power dynamics. He's endorsing Putin's revisionist vision for remaking international order, and whether he understands the implications of his rhetoric or is simply too ideologically blinkered to recognize how his language serves Russian interests is almost beside the point, because the effect is the same. There has been long-standing involvement of Russian oligarchs in Paul's home state of Kentucky, and he, like plenty of other Republican senators, has enjoyed the hospitality of Vladimir Putin, which raises questions that responsible oversight should be pursuing about what financial and political relationships might explain this pattern of conduct. The reconstruction challenge is genuinely staggering, and understanding its scope helps clarify why Russian assets must be seized rather than simply borrowed against. In 2025, the government of Ukraine, with support from donors, has allocated $7.37 billion to its priority areas, but a total financing gap of $9.96 billion for recovery and reconstruction needs remains for 2025 alone, meaning even with substantial international assistance, there's a nearly $10 billion shortfall just for the current year's most urgent needs. The sectors requiring reconstruction tell the story of systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure. The estimated cost of Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction stands at $524 billion over the next decade, with the biggest needs in housing at 33%, transport at 21%, energy and extractives at 12%, and commerce and industry at 10%. which reflects Russia's deliberate strategy of destroying the physical and economic foundations of Ukrainian statehood to make the country unviable as an independent nation. This is not collateral damage from military operations, but systematic targeting of the civilian infrastructure necessary for normal life, and when Paul suggests that seizing Russian assets might end peace negotiations, he's either ignorant of or indifferent to the fact that Russia has shown zero indication of negotiating in good faith, and every indication of using any pause in fighting to regroup and prepare for further offensives. Here's what makes the timing of Paul's obstruction particularly egregious. In July 2024, the G7 agreed to use windfall profits from interest on Russia's frozen assets to back loans to Ukraine, as part of the $50 billion G7 Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Loans Initiative, and the Treasury Department's December 2024 decision to disburse $20 billion in ERA loans to Ukraine, represented a carefully constructed international consensus that balanced legal concerns about sovereign immunity with the urgent need to fund Ukraine's defense and reconstruction. The Repo Implementation Act was designed to build on this foundation by moving toward actually transferring the principal assets rather than just their returns, and Paul's blockade means that the United States cannot take the leadership role in pushing our European allies to move beyond their hesitation and fully confiscate Russian assets. This matters enormously because American leadership has been absolutely critical to maintaining European unity on Ukraine policy, and when the United States signals ambivalence or appears divided on even clearly justified measures like making Russia pay for its own aggression, it provides ammunition to those European politicians who want to abandon Ukraine for economic convenience. The philosophy underlying Paul's position deserves interrogation, because it reveals the moral emptiness at the core of a certain kind of libertarian foreign policy thinking. There's a vision of American interests so cramped and transactional that it cannot comprehend how the survival of democratic nations matters to our own security, that treats alliances and international commitments as optional luxuries rather than the foundation of the peaceful order that has enabled American prosperity. When Paul invokes his oath to the Constitution, he's clothing his ideology in patriotic language, but the Constitution does not mandate isolationism or indifference to genocide, and the founders who created our system of government understood that American security depends on preventing the emergence of hostile hegemonic powers in Europe and Asia, which is why we've maintained alliance commitments and forward military presence for 80 years. The claim that somehow defending these interests violates constitutional principle represents an impoverished reading of both constitutional text and American strategic history, one that would have opposed the Marshall Plan and NATO and every other architecture that built the liberal international order. Let's address the concern about setting precedents for asset seizure more directly, because this is where the moral stakes become crystal clear. History will not judge the West well if it allows Ukraine to fall, because it does not wish to contravene international law, and there's something almost obscene about prioritizing abstract concerns about future legal doctrines over the immediate moral imperative of holding a genocidal aggressor accountable and providing its victims with the resources to rebuild. The international legal system was not created to protect nations that launch wars of territorial conquest from the consequences of their actions. It was created to prevent such wars, and when the system fails in its primary purpose of deterring aggression, the response cannot be to say that imposing meaningful consequences would violate the norms of that failed system. This is formalism elevated to the point of moral abdication, and it represents precisely the kind of legalistic thinking that allows atrocities to continue because we're more concerned with procedural correctness than substantive justice. The video shows a moment of raw Senate procedure, where one senator can halt bipartisan consensus through sheer obstinacy, but what you're really watching is the collision of two worldviews. One that understands American leadership requires demonstrating that international law has teeth and that aggression carries consequences, and another that treats international engagement as inherently suspect and American power as the primary threat to global stability. Senator Shaheen argued that Russia's illegal war in Ukraine has caused staggering destruction and loss of life, and Putin must be held accountable, with repurposing Russia's frozen sovereign assets, a necessary step to ensure Ukraine has the resources to defend itself and rebuild its communities, articulating the basic moral logic that should be uncontroversial. The nation that causes mass destruction should pay for reconstruction. But Paul's libertarian ideology cannot accommodate this straightforward principle, because it would require acknowledging that government action, including the seizure and transfer of assets, can serve moral ends and advance human freedom, which contradicts the foundational libertarian premise that government power is inherently threatening, regardless of how it's deployed. What compounds the frustration is that the American people broadly support Ukraine and recognize the stakes of this conflict, even if that support has eroded somewhat as the war drags on. But the Senate's procedural rules mean that a determined obstructionist can thwart the will of the majority and block legislation that has overwhelming support. This is one of those moments where the anti-majoritarian features of American government designed to protect minority rights become vehicles for minority obstruction of clearly justified policies, and when those procedural protections are deployed to shield an aggressor nation from accountability, they pervert the very purposes those protections were meant to serve. The founders created checks and balances to prevent tyranny, not to enable one senator to conduct his own private foreign policy through obstruction, and Paul's actions here represent a kind of constitutional abuse that exploits procedural rules for purposes completely divorced from their animating rationale. Think about the implications if Paul succeeds in significantly delaying or weakening the Repo Implementation Act. Russia gains more time to hide and move assets. European allies who are waiting for American leadership get the message that the United States is too divided to take decisive action and may decide to pursue their own accommodations with Moscow, and Ukraine faces yet another funding gap at precisely the moment when Russian forces are grinding forward in the east and systematically destroying energy infrastructure to make the coming winter unbearable. Every day of delay matters when you're talking about a nation fighting for survival, and Paul's abstract concerns about constitutional principle and multipolar world dynamics are luxuries that Ukraine's defenders huddling in trenches cannot afford. The senator speaks in the temperature-controlled comfort of the capital about the dangers of American hubris while Ukrainian medics perform battlefield surgery in makeshift hospitals under artillery fire, and if that juxtaposition doesn't clarify the moral stakes, then you're not paying attention. The Repo legislation represents more than just a funding mechanism. It's a statement of moral principle that the costs of aggression must be borne by aggressors, not by victims or by the international community trying to help those victims. And if Russian state assets were repurposed, they could cover the costs of 5 years of war, or 3/5 of the conservatively estimated reconstruction costs, which would fundamentally transform Ukraine's strategic position by removing the pressure to accept unfavorable peace terms, simply because the country cannot sustain both defense and basic governance without unlimited Western aid. This is what Paul's obstruction jeopardizes, not some abstract policy preference, but Ukraine's capacity to survive as an independent democratic nation. And when the Democratic senator in that clip called out his long-standing pattern of opposing sanctions and accountability, she was identifying behavior that functionally serves Russian interests regardless of the ideological justifications Paul offers. At some point we must ask whether the distinction between someone who deliberately advances Russian goals and someone who does so through misguided principle matters when the consequences are identical and the pattern is consistent across years of votes and statements. The tragedy is that this moment could have represented American moral leadership at its finest, using our financial system's central role in the global economy to enforce accountability for the most serious crimes against peace, demonstrating that the liberal international order has mechanisms to respond to aggression that go beyond military force, and providing Ukraine with resources to rebuild and survive without requiring endless appropriations from American and European taxpayers. Instead, we get one senator standing in the way, citing concerns that echo Kremlin talking points about American hubris and multipolar world dynamics, blocking legislation with overwhelming bipartisan support because his ideological commitments and procedural leverage allow him to substitute his judgment for the Senate's collective will. This is minoritarianism masquerading as constitutional principle, and its costs will be measured in Ukrainian lives and in the message it sends to every potential aggressor, watching how the West responds when authoritarian powers wage wars of conquest. Will there be meaningful consequences, or can determined obstruction by sympathetic voices in democratic capitals ensure that the international community never musters the political will to impose real costs? Rand Paul just answered that question, and Vladimir Putin is undoubtedly pleased with the reply.